Good morning. In this lecture, we are going to discuss the theories of second language acquisition. We mean by a theory of second language acquisition an explanation or an account which tries to show or to explain how this process happens. That is to say, how do second language learners learn a second language? The interest in second language acquisition theories is not new. It can be traced to the very beginning of the 20th century. In the history of second language acquisition research, we can distinguish two periods, that of behaviorism and after behaviorism. After behaviorism, there were many opposing accounts and explanations of the various aspects of second language acquisition. Some of these have progressed and continue to be prominent till now, while others have diminished in popularity or even disappeared. The period from the 80s onwards saw an expansion in the theories of SLA, and this research has become a relatively independent area of inquiry. This expansion was influenced in part by Chomskyan linguistics, but we should also recognize the influence of other fields. Let's focus on the main theories of second language acquisition in this lecture. The first theory is behaviorism, and it was popular in the 50s and the 60s. It is a theory initially formulated to explain first language acquisition, that is to say, how children acquire their mother tongues. And if you remember, in this paradigm, language learning is like learning any behavior, and it happens in terms of imitation or habit formation. The same thing can be said about a second language. It is believed to be learned as a habit. When we say that it occurs or it is learned as a habit, we mean that repetition and reinforcement are very important for learning to occur. The behaviorists say that the learners of a second language should be exposed to a considerable number of target examples of language. We mean by that a learner hears an utterance. The task of the learner is to reproduce this utterance or this model repetitively. Reproduction means pronunciation or repetition of the same utterance. The role of feedback is important here. When the imitation is exact, it receives positive feedback. When the imitation is faulty or inaccurate, there must be a rectification. In other words, only the correct imitations will be reinforced positively. The process of listening to utterances and repeating them should be repeated until these utterances become mechanical, because they are believed to be behaviors. Successful learning in this paradigm means that there are no errors. It is error-free. One may ask, who will provide feedback in the case of second language learning? Now, it is not the parent, as it is the case of first language acquisition. It is the role of a teacher. Sometimes the correct utterances are recorded on a tape, and when the learner produces his utterance, he will hear the correct form from the tape. If his form and the recorded form are the same, this is considered as a kind of positive feedback. On the whole, imitation is important by the learner, and it is considered a key element of the learning process. What distinguishes first language acquisition from second language learning in behaviorism is that the learners of a second language already know a first language. They already know a system. This system and its rules must be overcome in the process of acquiring a second language. The behaviorists believe that the errors which are produced by the learners, second language learners, are the result of interference from the mother tongue. This happens when the learners of a second language transfer the rules of the first language when learning the second one. Also, it is believed that the differences between the systems or the structures of L1 and L2 are the main source of difficulty, and they cause errors. The error itself is considered as evidence of lack of learning. For this reason, the errors must be eradicated according to the behaviorists. They should be eradicated because they are a sign of failure. We may ask, what are the techniques that behaviorists use to eradicate errors? The main technique is drilling, or reiteration of correct models, from the verb to drill. In drilling exercises, instantaneous and constant correction is provided, and this is considered the best technique to eliminate errors and facilitate language learning. Behaviorism gained popularity for many years, and it has influenced language teaching during the 50s and the 60s. However, after many years, this paradigm has become under attack, and many theorists have proved its inadequacy to explain the process of second language acquisition. And because of that, the 80s witnessed an expansion of multiple theories which try to serve as alternatives to behaviorism. It is possible to say that the theories which appeared after behaviorism can be classified into cognition-oriented and context-oriented theories. Here we stress the word cognition and the word context. The word cognition itself suggests the internal processes, or the cognitive, the mental processes. So the cognition-oriented theories take as their starting point the cognitive processes that underlie second language learning. Language learning is seen as a process occurring through inborn mechanisms. On the other hand, the theories which are context-based or context-oriented theories start from the context of learning, that is to say, the environment. We mean by the context the environment, the role of the environment. These theories emphasize the context itself and the ways in which it facilitates the process of learning. In other words, they stress the influence of the environment on learning. It is important to stress that cognition-oriented theories do not totally neglect context, and at the same time the context-oriented theories do not ignore cognition totally, but it is a matter of emphasis. So let's examine the array of theories in each category. The first cognition-oriented theory is called the creative construction hypothesis, or interlanguage theory. It appeared in the 70s. In the creative construction hypothesis, second language acquisition is considered to be similar to L1 acquisition. And for this reason, this theory is named the L1 equals L2 hypothesis. We mean by that similar processes are used when learning L1 or L2. The central question is, how does learning occur? For the supporters of this hypothesis, learners make unconscious hypotheses due to the input they receive from the environment. That is, a learner receives input from the environment. The second step is that the learner will extract the rules from the input he or she receives. For example, if a learner receives an input which contains the words taller, nicer, bigger, he will extract a temporary rule or an unconscious hypothesis which says that to form the comparative form of adjectives, we add er. Then the learner will use this hypothesis when producing his own comparative forms. We do not call these rules, but we call them hypotheses because they are temporary. A learner may change them. When the learner uses new forms in his speech and notices that they do not match the target language forms, he will revise the hypothesis. The hypothesis is revised, that is to say, it is slightly modified to fit the speech of the target language users. This happens several times until the learner reaches the target language rule, with all its exceptions. In this paradigm, language acquisition is a learner internal driven process, and it is guided by the innate mechanisms. We say that L2 learners process language and create their own internal grammar. That is a system with specific rules. This system is called interlanguage. The symbol of interlanguage is IL. Sometimes some scholars call it transitional competence because it is transitional. It changes continuously. Interlanguage is a system which is in between the mother tongue and the target language. Generally, interlanguage cannot be the same as the second language. This happens as a result of fossilization. Fossilization means the persistence of some forms, some faulty forms. When the learner does not correct some faulty forms, they fossilize. According to the proponents of the creative construction hypothesis, many of the innate mechanisms which are used by the learners are specific to language learning, rather than being of a general cognitive nature. One may say that input is important in this theory, but the supporters of this theory argue that input acts as a trigger to stimulate the mechanisms, but the most important thing is the mechanisms themselves. The major argument in support of the creative construction hypothesis consisted of the morpheme studies. These are studies conducted by specialists. According to these studies, the results of these studies indicate that learners of different L1 backgrounds, of different mother tongues, seem to acquire the features of the target language in an identical order. They follow the same stages. It is important to stress the major features of the creative construction hypothesis. The first major feature is that first language transfer or interference from the mother tongue is insignificant. That is to say, L1 is not responsible or does not affect learning. This has a relationship with the errors which are produced by the learners. The errors which are produced by the learners are not seen as a result of the influence of L1, but as a result of the hypotheses which are made by the learners. The second major feature of the creative construction hypothesis is that there is universality or commonness in acquisition sequences. That is to say, all learners follow the same stages. On the whole, we can say that in this hypothesis, L2 learning is seen as the result of mental processing of the received input rather than influenced directly by the input itself. Universal grammar is the second cognition-oriented theory. This theory is associated with Noam Chomsky's school of thought. Noam Chomsky is a prominent figure in the innatist trend. According to him, all human beings are equipped with a language acquisition device, or the LAD. Universal grammar is the knowledge contained in the LAD. It is innate and it matures. One important idea in universal grammar is the idea of black box. Chomsky believes that universal grammar acts or functions as an independent black box, which receives input and then enables humans to produce an output. Let's talk about the constituents or the components of the black box. The black box contains principles and parameters. Principles differ from parameters. The principles are true universals. That is to say, they occur in all or nearly all languages. The parameters, on the other hand, occur across languages in one form or another. That is to say, languages differ at the level of parameters. The theory of universal grammar claims that the principles are already wired into the human brain when we are born, and they govern all languages, whereas the parameters have to be set for particular languages. Let's take the example of the head principle and the head parameter. The head is a notion that exists in grammar. For example, the head of a noun phrase. The principle of head exists in all languages. That is to say, all phrases in all languages have a head element, that is to say, a principal element. For example, the head of a noun phrase. This is shared by all languages. But the parameters differ. In English, for instance, we say, a beautiful picture. In Arabic, we say, Suratun Jamila. If we look at the position of the head, which is picture or surah, we'll notice that its place differs across languages. In English, the modifier precedes the head, but in Arabic the head comes first. In that case, we say that both Arabic and English have the concept of head. Both of them have heads in their noun phrases. This is a universal feature, but they differ in the placement of the head in the phrase itself. When learning a second language, the learner's task is to discover how the parameters should be set for the particular languages they are learning. The third cognition-oriented theory is the input hypothesis, or the monitor model. This theory is very wide-ranging. Essentially, this theory incorporates the creative construction hypothesis. That is to say, it is part of it. It was formulated by Stephen Krashen, and it became popular beginning in the 70s. Although this hypothesis is placed within the cognition-oriented theories, in this paradigm, language learning is viewed as a complex interaction of both internal and external factors. The internal factors refer to the construction process, the creative construction process, and the external factors refer to the quality or the type of input. Let's talk about the type of input that is highlighted in this hypothesis. For learning to occur, a special type of input is needed, and this is called comprehensible input. What is meant by a comprehensible input is a type of input in the target language, types of utterances in the target language that is understandable. It can be understood by the learner, but somewhat more advanced than the learner's present level. This means that the input has two parts. Part of it is known already to the learner, and part of it is new. Comprehensible input can be built on previous structures which are learned by the learner. For this reason, it is considered as more advanced than the learner's present level, but it's not totally incomprehensible to him or her. Comprehensible input is often shortened to a symbol, I plus 1, where I, the letter I, refers to the learner's current level. It means what the learner already knows, and plus 1 denotes the slightly more advanced input, that is to say, the addition that is made in the input. The supporters of this hypothesis believe that when learners are introduced to this type of input, L2 acquisition was thought to develop automatically and in the same fashion as L1 acquisition. But at the same time, introduction or exposing the learner to comprehensible input is not enough, and learning cannot occur unless the learner's affective filter is low. We mean by the affective filter the emotional barrier or the level of anxiety. And learning does not occur if the level of anxiety is high. Learning takes place when the level of anxiety is low. Finally, according to the input hypothesis, learning is considered to be a conscious process, and it often occurs through instruction or error correction. The first context-oriented theory is called the interaction hypothesis. In fact, it is a development of the input hypothesis, and it appeared in the early 80s. In this theory, there are two elements which are important in the learning process. The first element is comprehensible input, which is the condition of learning. And the second one is interaction, which represents a set of circumstances which enable input to be made comprehensible. Of course, interaction refers to the conversations which take place between learners and other interlocutors. Conversation or interaction helps learners to comprehend the input. So interaction is vital in learning. The interaction hypothesis posits that interactions play a fundamental role in second language acquisition processes, and this can be done in two ways. Interactions help in input modification and also in giving feedback. What is meant by input modification, and how does interaction help in doing so? In the course of interaction, the interlocutors modify their input, and input modification occurs when the interlocutor perceives that the learner does not understand what is being said, and for this reason they restate something by simplifying this utterance or exemplifying, that is, giving examples, or otherwise altering or changing the original statement. The other way in which interaction helps learning is by giving feedback, and this is related to the linking of meaning and form. Feedback occurs when the interlocutor uses particular devices to inform the learner about something he or she has said. It is known that when learners attempt to communicate with other speakers in the target language, they experience difficulties and they engage in further interaction with their interlocutors to resolve their problems of communication. The interactions, therefore, provide opportunities for the negotiation of meaning. The learner, for example, may produce a request for clarification. It is a question, which shows that the learner does not understand. The learner sometimes repeats. The interlocutors provide confirmations and sometimes reformulations of the learner's utterances. A reformulation means casting the learner's utterance in a correct form, therefore it is sometimes called a recast. The interlocutors also can produce comprehension checks. They are utterances which are used by the communicators to check comprehension. Using all these devices will help the input to be tuned to the level of competence of the learner. The following are examples which show what happens during interaction. In the first conversation between a native speaker and a non-native speaker, or it can be a teacher and a learner, we have examples of clarification requests and repetitions and simplification. The native speaker says, there's just a couple more things. Then the learner says, sorry, couple, which is a clarification request. The native speaker repeats. He says, couple more things in the room, only just a couple. The non-native speaker pronounces the word couple. The learner says, couple? What does it mean, couple? And this is a clarification request. The native speaker answers like two things, or two or three things. This is a kind of simplification. Then the learner says more, and this is considered a confirmation. In the second example, the non-native speaker or the learner says, the windows are closed. This is an utterance which contains a mistake. Then the native speaker or the teacher produces a clarification request. The windows have what? The learner tries to modify his form, closed, and says closed. Kind of repetition with modification. The native speaker says crossed. I'm not sure what you are saying there. Still asking for clarification. And this leads the learner to produce the correct form in his final utterance, saying windows are closed. This represents a modified output. The third example is different. It is an instance of a recast. The student or the learner says the boy have many flowers in his basket, containing a mistake. The teacher responds positively, but using just a recast, saying that, yes, the boy has many flowers in his basket. In this case, the teacher reproduced the same utterance and corrected the error without being negative. These are examples of negotiation of meaning, and they show how interaction helps learners to move towards the production of correct utterances in L2. That is to say, how interaction helps learners to learn L2 forms. The second context-oriented theory is called the output hypothesis. According to its name, output hypothesis is based on the output, not the input. In other words, it is based on what the learner produces in terms of language, not on what he or she receives from the environment. So the relationship here is between producing something in the target language, in the second language, and the ability to learn it. Are they related to each other or not? It is believed in the output hypothesis that successful second language acquisition requires not only comprehensible input, but also comprehensible output. Here, comprehensible output refers to output that is understood by the listeners. This is related to the work of Merrill Swain. The basic principle in the output hypothesis is that forcing learners to speak or encouraging them to speak in the second language will lead them to acquire it. The question that arises is, how can we force learners to speak? This is by putting them in a situation where they have to construct an utterance in the target language, in the second language. When learners produce utterances in the second language, this production may support them to move to syntactic processing. That is to say, they analyze their own utterances syntactically. Let's compare here the comprehension of an utterance and the production of an utterance. It is held in this hypothesis that the comprehension of an utterance or a message can happen with little syntactic analysis of the input. The learner does not try to analyze, but the production itself forces the learners to pay attention to the means of expression, to the way of constructing their utterances. Output gives learners opportunities to make hypotheses about how the grammatical system of the second language works, and they get feedback about whether these hypotheses are correct or not. The third context-oriented theory is the scaffolding hypothesis, also called socioculturalism. The scaffolding hypothesis is based on the sociocultural theory. This is a theory of psychology developed by Vygotsky. It is about the way people interact with others and culture they live in, and how this can help them to shape their mental abilities. This account of second language acquisition rejected both linguistic theory and cognitive theory as being too mind and brain oriented, and alternatively, they positioned the learner as a dynamic participant in learning within specific social contexts. Let's focus on the core factor of learning in this hypothesis. In the scaffolding hypothesis, social interaction is the most important incentive for all learning, interaction. Interaction facilitates language learning. Sociocultural theorists say that interactions between individuals are the source of all cognitive development, including the development of language. In this hypothesis, a special kind of interaction is considered. It is the interaction between a less skilled L2 learner and a more expert other. This other can be a teacher, a tutor, or more skillful fellow learner, a peer. Central in this type of interaction is the idea of scaffolding. The expert can afford the learner a form of scaffolding. What do we mean by the term scaffolding? Scaffolding refers to the way in which, with the support from others, learners can attain levels of achievement, of course in the target language, in the second language, which they would be not capable to reach autonomously, alone. Scaffolding is the verbal assistance through the use of language, which an expert provides to help a learner complete any specific language task, or the verbal cooperation of peers to perform a task which would be too difficult for any one of them individually. What happens during scaffolding is that the expert simplifies the task, of course the linguistic task. He controls the learner's frustration. He models solutions and brings the learner's attention to important features of the task. Imagine here a teacher helping a student to understand some part of a text, for example. The expert can provide the learner with the chance to expand and practice a specific linguistic skill, enabling the learner to achieve more. The use of scaffolding in language classrooms is very productive, but it is very difficult in large classes. The fourth context-oriented theory is the acculturation model and social identity theory. Both of them are related to culture. The notion of acculturation refers to a process, intentional or unintentional. It means a person can do this on purpose or just because he is put in a given situation, this happens to him, by which an individual or group adopts one or more of another group's cultural or linguistic features. The result is new or blended cultural or linguistic patterns, language patterns. Acculturation involves adaptation and also change. The acculturation model as a theory of second language acquisition, associated with John Schumann, claims that the process of acculturation, that is adapting to a new culture, is directly linked to acquisition. It increases acquisition. There are social and psychological factors that have a direct effect on the success L2 learners have in acquiring a second language. Every language is connected to a culture, and the learner, when exposed to the language, is at the same time exposed to the target language culture. According to this theory, success in learning a second language depends on one thing. It is the extent to which learners adjust completely to the target language culture. Here, two major factors are identified in acculturation: social distance and psychological distance. Both the social distance and the psychological distance from the target culture can hinder the acquisition of a second language. Sometimes a person never acquires a new language just because of certain distance that exists between the two linguistic groups, the group to which the learner belongs and the native speakers of the target language. Researchers in this theory maintain that success in second language learning has a lot to do with the learner's degree of acculturation into the second language culture. Now let's talk about the social identity model. This model is very close to the acculturation model. This is a theory formulated by Peirce and Norton. Social identity refers to the relationship between the individual and the larger social world. The model holds that learners' social identities influence how successful they will be in learning a second language. This is based on the reciprocated influences that link language and identity. A person consolidates his or her identity in a new community, so his or her ability to speak and learn the language increases. In that case, if a learner identifies himself with the target community, it will be easy for him to learn the target language. In conclusion, we can say that the relatively new field of second language acquisition includes a range of approaches to explaining second language learning. All of them try to show how second language learning occurs, and it tries to show also the factors which improve second language learning. The objective of most second language acquisition research is to reach an all-inclusive theory. This is a fundamental objective. However, we notice that each of the existing theories considers the problem of accounting for second language learning process from a somewhat special perspective. They differ in their perspectives. Some are cognitively oriented and others are context oriented. On the whole, we can say that most theories have started from preceding research, the criticism of preceding research, and in their continuing progress have offered promising outlooks on the second language learning process. Understanding how second language learning takes place is very productive and beneficial for many other spheres, especially the sphere of language teaching. Now, researchers are increasingly borrowing insights from associated disciplines and approaches like cognitive science, psychology, sociology, cultural studies, and so on. This is done to improve the understanding of second language acquisition. Therefore, theory development and testing this theory in this field is getting richer and richer.